Hello, welcome to another webinar hosted by the Hill for Literacy, where we strive to create a world of readers by supporting education leaders at the state, district, and school level, as well as teachers to design systems that ensure evidence-based instruction is provided to all students. My name is Benjamin Schurz, and I'm delighted to host our guests, Tim Odegard and Dr. Gierka today, who will share their insights into learning science. Tim is a professor of psychology and the Catherine Davis Murphy Chair of Excellence in Dyslexic Studies at Middle Tennessee State University, where he leads the Tennessee Center for the Study and Treatment of Dyslexia. A contributing author to IDA's Knowledge and Practice Standards for Teachers of Reading, Dr. Odegard is committed to advancing literacy as a human right and supports initiatives through service leadership. And Dr. Gierka turns research into practice and practice back into better research. I love that loop. A nationally recognized implementation scientist, literacy consultant, and co-author of an upcoming book, she spent over a decade in Pennsylvania public schools teaching learners from preschool through 12th grade. She saw firsthand what happens when the right instruction reaches the right student at the right time. Tim and Megan, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
We are so excited to be here. And I will also say to anyone in the audience that knows us, Ben's impression of us is that we're very prim and proper. So our goal is to keep up this beautiful impression that Ben and Marcy Kate have created of us. So welcome. And Hill, thank you. This is our, at least my very first webinar with y'all, and you've been so fun to collaborate. Today, we are thrilled to talk about Rome wasn't built on a scope and sequence. We're going to go deep into Roman history. Not really.
No,
not. Though it would be fun. Our goal here today is really to talk about where this beautiful convergence of all that we know about reading science and all that we need to bring in from learning science, and where that translation is pretty easy and also where it's complex. So without further ado, I think every teacher needs a Tim, and I've been working with Tim for over the past year, and I think Tim has been instrumental in helping me bridge not only that research to practice, but that practice to research. And a lot of these principles that we've been talking about and grappling with, this whole presentation was born out of us very curious about the implementation of a certain principle and trying to make it happen. Anything to add there, Tim?
Well, I think every researcher needs a Megan, because the virtuous cycle is that we may have a theory, but we should then try to implement that theory in what matters and take it into the field and go to scale with things, and then go back in and refine our theories, because if it won't work in reality, then it's not a good theory. And all theories are close approximations to a rule or a law, and we don't have many laws in science. So we have gravity, we know it works, and we have the law of effect in psychology. After that, we got Hebb's law. We don't have many laws. We have a lot of theories, so we have close approximations. And that means that in these things that we put science of in front of, we get a lot of debates and arguments around things, because we have people who are maybe closer to the practice and the realities in the world, and maybe some people who are close to the theory. So when we don't form partnerships and come together, then it makes it challenging for us to actually create a virtuous cycle where we rotate through practice to research, research to practice, and back and forth again.
Yeah, so well said, Tim. And I think this is what makes it so fun to be with Hill right now, because it seems this is their specialty, their bread and butter. And we're excited to be here. Three main pieces we're going to talk about today. The basics of learning architecture, where we're going right, where we're going wrong, little areas to refine. We're going to talk about the importance of practice, and also some places where practice may be kind of going off the rails. And the most important thing, we saved it for last. It's all about the different kind of texts that we've been experimenting with. And this has probably been one of the coolest side projects I've done in the last few months, and really excited to dive in that with you today. So first and foremost, we are here really because we're talking about that widening research to practice gap. And, while we know in the literature, 15 years, Tim, the research we're citing today, back in the late 1800s, some of it,
Some of it, yeah. One of my mentors, Valerie Reyna, who set up the Institutes for Educational Science and other things, and actually set up the potential things that funded a lot of research that we're talking about when it comes to education, said that it normally took about 20 years for things to kind of move out of cognitive science into practice and application in education. And I don't think she was taking a jab on education. She was talking about an implementation gap, because Valerie's cognitive science research was also being funded by the National Institutes of Health, and we were doing studies on medical decision making with medical medical doctors, and likewise. So there's broad application of this idea of cognitive science or learning sciences beyond education. We're going to focus particularly on educational research applications.
So well said. And I think part of where I think we're coming at odds when we think about the reading science translation as well as the learning science translation is we're talking about one of the most complex phenomenon our brains engage in. And we are so desperate to attach it to such a binary framework. This is just a replication of the big 5 pillars. But really, we learn best when we integrate.
Correct.
And there's a new blueprint in town, Tim. You got anything to say about this hierarchy?
Well, it's a framework, and all frameworks are close approximations and aren't even theory. So the last slide had a representation of a framework, or actually a theory, that Young-Suk Kim has put forward that really talks about the integration of reading and writing and the pillars upon which that builds on, and that language kind of undergirds at a very fundamental level these things. And this is her work is really not getting into representations and learning mechanisms as much as how they're interfacing and interrelated, and why it's so important and so powerful when we do integrated approaches across literacy. And one of the breakdowns that we've seen in the translation of structured literacy in the info map has been, it talks a lot about the what and not nearly as much about the why of structured literacy, or the why of literacy instruction if structured literacy gives you hives. This idea here is this framework about going from the initial acquisition of new knowledge to creating accuracy with it, moving to automaticity. Fluency really is, in this framework, an automaticity, becoming automatic and effortless in doing something that then becomes so effortless and automatic that we can generalize into new context and we can adapt it for new problem solving. That's the gist.
Yeah, it's the gist. And I think just when we're talking about Young-Suk Kim's model, we're going to learn best by integrating different pieces of some of this framework and translating it in different ways. And excited to kind of show you what that looks like and model it out for you. It was a lot harder than we ever could have thought.
And it was harder for a really important thing. One of the things that's challenging, and this is actually is well said, and there's actually a video I did with Nancy Hennessy where we're talking about the aspects of practice that are inherent to some things of structured literacy. And it's the cumulative nature of language and the cumulative nature of written language. So the idea that Nancy often will espouse is this idea that it's building on one another. And the ideas of, let's say, interleaving practice that we'll be highlighting and featuring apply to isolated word context. They apply to flashcards you might be using. They apply to text passages. And one of the challenges that we often find is that in different forms of text that provide and support different types of learning, you'll have different types of levels of accuracy and automaticity embedded within a text passage, especially a stretch read, or what a child would actually have to do when they leave your intervention group or a classroom and go to science or math or history class and have to use and generalize what you're teaching them. That is a goal. And one of the things that I want to stress, and will stress again, is you have to practice doing the thing you want them to do, which means that we always have to be thinking when they leave us to be independent readers, they have to practice different types of things, but they have to practice what I want them to be able to do. Transfer of learning doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes from doing the thing that you want them to do. We know that.
Yeah. And you know what? There is going to be a lot of questions as we're going through this. As we're starting to translate this, we're going to be very honest about places where there's a lot of research to support and places where there needs to be research for. So if you have questions for us, please hit it up in the Q&A as we kind of go through and unpack this. We tried to put a ton of related research as well as just some of the key principles in a handout for you, but feel free to drop some of those questions in the Q&A and let's get going. Let's get focused a little bit. We spend so much time on the what. Let's get focused on the actual how of this and talk about this learning architecture. So how do we learn in general? Tim, this is your favorite quote, so I'll let you take it away.
Well, this is something that a colleague of mine at MIT has said, and some thoughts that we've been having about designing some of what will be shared at the Big Sky Literacy Summit up in Montana later in this summer. And her point is you can't beat evolution, and that has a very specific meaning when it comes to the architecture we're talking about of learning. And then here's the thing that also is really critical. Learning happens at the intersection of time, effort, and attention. And that's really important. Where you have your kids place their time in their day, is where they're focusing that valuable limited commodity, where they're being effortful in their activities. That's where that effort's going to translate to durable learning. And it does take attention, because where you're focusing will draw your attention. And I want to make a distinction here. If you're reading a novel, you're engrossed in the novel and you actually are attending to aspects of the novel. And that's really key. But those are key. And really what we mean by the evolution is that there's some aspects in this brain that come more wired for doing certain types of learning than others. Some are evolutionary older, and there's multiple systems that are running at once. We have this epiphenomenon of having a singular person that we call me or I, that we think is a whole. We have multiple learning systems that are running, multiple systems that are happening in our brain that are evolutionarily from different stages. And they're all undergirding and supporting aspects of language learning and literacy. And that's really, really key. So we have to keep that up. And the fact that our cognition and the input in here is limited creates a bottleneck. And artificial intelligence does not have that. You can feed it the library from Congress and put it all in there, but you cannot do that for our brain. So there's inherent bottlenecks that are created in the capacity for us to learn. And that's what Jill's trying to get at here, which is when we think about instructional design and the learning of that design, where are you focusing? Where's the time spent? Where are they spending their effort? And then what is that gravitating their attention to? And think about what that will mean for transfer into what you really ultimately want them to do.
Y'all, I just had an Alani, so I'm a little jazzed up. But I think if I could summarize that beautiful monologue, Tim, I would say, make the kids do the thing.
Correct.
So if you want them to get better at reading, make them
Read.
read, perhaps. Make them write, perhaps. And that's going to be a central theme that we're going to chat about today. We won't go deep into this, but this is just kind of basic learning architecture. To know that, to know how. To know that, things we can tell others that we know versus to know how, non-declarative learning, things that we can, know and be able to do. And a great example of this, and Tim, I'll let you explain this part before we dive into an example here. But I think when we talk about what we're asking our kiddos to learn, especially when we talk about standards, we've been unpacking text complexity in general. We're really talking about this progression from concepts to skills to strategies. So concepts are knowledge about how all the different writing mechanisms work, our declarative knowledge for what some of those things mean. And then, Tim, we get into skills.
Skills are really the skills that we can apply them to. Decoding automatically is a skill. The ability to effortlessly apply a word strategy like vowel alert to the vowel and then try the different pronunciations that you have to try to solve that problem of how do I pronounce that when I don't know it is a skill that's relying on a strategy, these strategies we're building on. So the knowledge we teach of the language and of words are going to afford us to apply those in practice and develop skills that we want to get to automaticity, such as pronouncing words, such as accessing the word's meaning, such as drawing inferences when we need to. But we also have to have strategies to where we can pause, stop, and reflect when we come into challenge. A stretch read, and when you're reading in a classroom, and as adults when we read, you are going to bump into words that you don't know. And what that's going to force you to do is think about how do I tackle that and what strategies do I bring to bear to get to that word, from what it means to how do I pronounce it so I can move on. Then this is really important. So Megan and I work a lot with Freddie Hebert. What Freddie Hebert's work with word zones really tells us is when we get to disciplinary text, the lowest frequency words that'll be likely isolated and not really related to other things in a network of what they sound like and what they look like with letters are going to be the ones that'll be in every text that we have to start consuming as we're going through the higher levels of reading. And we need to have them model and practice putting the concepts into skills, but then also when those skills aren't going to serve us in that moment, to have the strategies to unlock the language for its meaning as well as for its how you pronounce it and how you spell it.
Absolutely. And in its most basic form, we can be doing flashcards showing T-top T, but our goal is really to have an understanding that every time we see that grapheme, we know it says T, right? And I actually did a fun little quiz with my husband, and I'm happy to do it with you all. Tim and I just did this at Plain Talk. But up here on the screen, you can see a left and a right representation of a nonsense word. And right off the bat, we don't even need to wait long. You can tell me which one is the correct orthographical representation because you know English. You know how English works. I was just doing this with my husband about 20 minutes ago. He couldn't tell me that FL was a consonant blend and that's why it appeared that way. He just knew how, and it was quick. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're kind of moving from this very explicit instruction to the implicit tuning of our language, the implicit tuning that happens through self-teaching, through practice. And that's going to be the big goal of our session today. So while we think of this binary framework, the instructional hierarchy, and we've seen great research on this. Shout out Matt Burns, great colleague of me and Tim's, with his skill by treatment interaction framework, where he's studied this and seen a lot of efficacy with it. We know that this is a great framework for intervention, but when we're starting to apply it for the tier 1 setting, we have to make some instructional shifts, and we're excited to talk about them. So real quick, true or false, do it on your own there. Explicit instruction and implicit learning are critical to reading development. What do you think, Tim?
I think that's true. And here's something that I told to our colleague Jan Hasbrook, and it kind of made her eyes pop out, because we often make these dichotomies. Jan, you never turn off implicit learning. Time, effort, and attention. You are learning and extracting. What matters is how we structure the environment in a way. This goes way back in the cognitive science to research of Gibson from the 1970s, with how we create variable contrast in learning opportunities for us to extract the patterns that allow us to generalize beyond the explicit declarative. That's what the learning that we want to have is. So they're both happening. And in fact, you can't turn off implicit learning. You can only optimize the learning environment and give them the opportunities to have practice doing the thing to create the abstractions needed to generalize.
So well said. And, I've done some great work with Lene Airy, and she's one of the greatest mentors in my life. And we talk so much about her work and her orthographic mapping theory, but we also have to talk about David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis and his new blueprint and all of this work on statistical learning that's starting to emerge now, especially in the early literacy space. We have a lot of work to do. We know it's a critical factor. It's always happening. And we're still kind of trying to figure out that shift of that optimal area. And we're hoping we can start to answer some of those questions. So hopefully we got some of that learning architecture, but now we're going to get into practice. And I think we can talk a lot about explicit instruction, and I don't want Anita all mad over at me or Engelman mad, but explicit instruction is great. It's really great for initial introduction of a concept, but that explicit instruction is the most prone to forgetting. Quick learning is quick forgetting. And you might have a baby who they can get those short A words, snap, 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 just like that. They do the end of the lesson, but then the next day they've completely forgotten it because quick learning means quick forgetting. And what that looks like, and this is that research all the way back from the late 1800s, early 1900s, is this forgetting curve. And what we're doing with essential and good practice is helping add those reps to help build storage strength. And you can kind of see here, there's retrieval strength, how much you're able to remember day to day through some of that work. But there's also this growing storage strength that happens from that practice and that implicit learning. It's the slower of the learning systems. I will not argue that they're going to get this the next day or even the next week. It's slower, it takes time, and it builds up. But our goal is for them to build up that storage strength so that years down the road, they see those nonsense words like flarm, and they're able to say right off the way, this is the correct orthographic representation because they've seen it, they've practiced it.
Well, they've extracted the patterns that represent that. So they're pattern recognizing, and that takes an implicit learning mechanism to do that.
Absolutely. It's kind of like our brains in some ways are like LLMs, always just attuning to patterns and statistics in its own weird way.
We got to move through these slides, so let's just keep on going.
We can go all day. Listen, we've been doing some great work with AI, but
if you want to talk about feature vector mapping and how LLMs work, I'm your boy for that. It's a big version of what I used to use in a program called Minerva 2. That's all it is. And they got these things on it that help to direct attention and different retrieval mechanisms. So if that's what you want to know about, which it's not, you want to know about how do you structure your practice to have it based off of principles that will help you move from something that's written in sand to something that's written in stone that will last for decades and ages and the millennia.
Absolutely. And you'll see here on screen, we're not going to go super deep into the types of practice because we want to show you what it looks like. But there's that blocked practice where you have that short U sound. And I made one little mistake there with nod for nud, but that short U blocked practice. And then you have interleaved practice.
Correct.
And you might do blocked practice for that initial introduction of the skill so that the student can see it in isolation and practice it perfectly for a few minutes. And then right away, we're going to move to what, Tim?
Well, we're going to move to interleave practice. So we're going to quickly introduce this into our treasure trove of things that we're practicing in different varied contexts. And so if we keep moving, I think we might have an example of what that might look like. Because we've done a mass, let's say we introduce a new learning and we've had them discover that new learning through discovering like what's similar between 3 written words and what they're seeing on the board if we're doing word study. And then we introduce that as a concept. You might even have a handy dandy keyword and sound card that you want to show up, and that's fine. That's a memory aid. This is all declarative knowledge building for them. And then we might actually put up and have them read 5 to 10 instances of that context. What happens though is that as you're seeing the same pattern over, your brain disengages. I've seen this with my own fMRI research. You can see it with EEG using time frequency analysis, and the alpha band switches, and we move to some more of a default network. What we're doing is we see that this is creating a lack of activation. You're not actually effortlessly processing things anymore. So by set shifting and shifting things while we interleaving things, it actually forces us to re-engage the neural architecture that we need to be forming in our phonological representations, in the motor patterns that are activating when we're thinking about this, and they're going up to the somatosensory network and into the visual word form area that's forming those orthographic patterns. When we mass, we've actually know from, I mean, my research is old in this area, over 2 decades now, that we see a deattenuation. We see less activation neuronally, or we see a shift in the time frequency that shows us the different attentional networks that are being brought to bear on a learning task. And a mass practice situation will create a disengagement at the neuronal level.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to show kids the properties of how other words connect to what they're learning, what that new learning is, what that new learning is not, and spacing it out over time. Great book. Make It Stick is a great introduction to some of these principles of practice, and actually brings in all different examples from sports to medical to medicine and everything if you really want to do a deeper dive there.
And the space is important because when you space it, you have to re-retrieve it. And when we re-retrieve something, it brings it up into this malleable state. And you're able to link in other retrieval cues. You're able to reconsolidate it. So it's a really critical learning mechanism. Again, back to that neuronal activation. And this goes to different research that I used to do when I was with Reed Line at the Center for Brain Health, and we were working with US veterans who were PTSD survivors. It really gets into this idea of what is memory and what is it activating. And we were trying novel ways of actually getting them to forget things that were being a trigger for their trauma, because when you bring something back, you can manipulate it. What we do with learning is we put new retrieval pathways when it's malleable to actually gain access to something. It's really a basic learning mechanism at a neuronal level.
Well, Tim, Ben thought we were prim and proper. When we put this slide in, it was like, ooh,
Uh-oh,
you
this one's
sure?
not good. This is going to piss some people off.
Hey, we're being nice here. We're here to argue and stretch our thinking, which is why we're here on this Thursday afternoon.
Correct.
But the idea of helps all, harms none, we'd argue that there is some harm maybe being done when we don't apply the correct practice. And for sake of this today, big fan of Becky Allen and doing some great work with her across the pond. But she's been helping me understand this expertise reversal effect. And I add this phenomenon, an asterisk, that this has not yet been studied in literacy environments that I'm well aware of. But what we're basically hypothesizing, your working memory is what it is. And if experts are given this same level of scaffolds and supports as novices, it's actually going to tax their working memory and inhibit their ability to continue learning.
We also know in the literacy, we do know one thing in the literacy space is that it can actually create demotivation and disengagement. Now, I mean, this is important. If you want to teach linguistic concepts and you want to directly teach them, I'm okay with that happening. But when we then spend 20 minutes in a block setting with a lot of teacher talk and not a lot of kids doing the thing, then what we're doing is that we have kids disengage. Megan and I were in a classroom just a couple months ago, and I saw at least one little kid who, when he actually did the thing and it came the time to do that, he did it perfectly, but was totally disengaged otherwise. So the motivational factor is a real thing there. I'm not saying, and I'm not going to speak for Megan, that I don't want you to teach these pieces of knowledge necessarily, but I want us to think thoughtfully about how we structure and differentiate those pieces of knowledge and how we have to break up the classroom setting to allow it to be given with the repetition that's needed for some people to solidify that, especially for the ones who will need more support to use that as a strategy. And those are the building blocks of a strategy for them to be accurate and independent readers. But that's not all readers.
Exactly. Not all readers. And I loved this tweet that came up about probably about 2 weeks ago. And it was a child who spelled the word bunches correctly on their spelling test, but still got it scored wrong because they coded it wrong. And I loved what they put here. The tail is wagging the dog here. If the goal is for them to be able to do the thing, if they're able to do the thing, we don't need to focus on some of that declarative stuff. So just a word of caution. When we think about practice, Carl Hendrick just wrote a great blog on this about lethal mutations. Couple things to keep in mind of. First and foremost, if you quiz a pattern one day and then don't come back to it the next day, obviously a problem. We need to interleave that practice. Targeting keywords, very common in your deck to go C, cookie, k, and over again. That can be an important scaffold for initial introduction until it's solidified.
Correct.
But once they got it, the scaffold goes away. The training wheels go away. These little poppets, Tim, you and I have been in a lot of classrooms lately. These little poppets that I'm seeing in second grade classrooms to help blend words, they do not need those poppets. Put them away. Make them write the words. Stop over scaffolding, take the training wheels off, and get these babies in text, which is what we're here to talk about. I won't even get into that slide, Tim, because that one's even dicier.
Yeah, we don't need to, because we need to start showing that what we're talking about to make it clear that we're not saying to abandon direct instruction.
Exactly. Direct instruction is going to be critical. And we're basically going to take that hierarchy that we were talking about of how that progression of how we learn. And we're going to look at structuring practice and text to build the storage strength. And we're going to push kids a little bit further than we may be comfortable with, but we argue is going to be a really important thing to help them solidify that learning. So on screen here, you'll see an example. This is from 95% group, their scope and sequence. It's not necessarily how they structure their practice. It's just their scope and sequence.
Correct.
And all the way up top, we kind of took that hierarchy and kind of swooped, put it down like this. And you could see up top that very first introduction of that A-R-O-R sound in pink. And that new learning is going to take the place over 3 days. So that direct, explicit mass practice of that new skill. Then over time, you see as new skills are being introduced, that skill is being moved out of that mass practice environment and being moved into that deck or in that area where it's being practiced to fluency, not just in that deck, but also within the text to practice that as well. And Tim, that bottom part that we added, I think is going to be the area where we're going to spend the most amount of time on. We have a whole 30 minutes left of this webinar. I think that idea of moving kids beyond that decodable, very controlled environment into a more of a stretched environment where they're kind of very much at the end of their decodability is going to be a big, important part of the conversation.
So what we're showing you is a phased approach to introducing different concepts. And if we keep moving through the slide deck, you'll see see that what we want to do is that we're going to be building off of known science when it comes to like what the federal government here in the United States has funded. This is an old practice guide. Once I've introduced a concept, I'm going to interleave it. So I've got on the left, I've got high frequency words. It's not uncommon, and this is not the only context that you would see high frequency words in, to create decks that are built and they go through it. There's something called a Leitner box that goes through different phases of things when they become learned. And then we want to go to a point of like truly consolidating. And those are taken from what are near this lesson that we're modeling here in the scope and the sequence of instruction for 95% group. So I want to make sure that I have this interleave practice. So these are high frequency words that are from the last several lessons, and that we're bringing them in here. We're going to practice them in this quick drill format that will take me no more than 2 minutes on my students. I want to have it. They're interleaved because I'm bringing in concepts from other lessons. They're spaced because this is daily, and they're going to be variable context because when I and I shuffle them, I change the context of where they're positioned in the deck. So I varied the context. All three of those learning mechanisms will result in better learning. Now on the right, what you have there is you have two different examples of different levels of difficulty of interleaving the concepts that are targeted in one of those lessons we were showing up there. So once you've introduced the concept and they've got to read it a little bit, we can introduce it into isolated word reading practice. You'll notice that I'm taking the concept words, the target words for that one of the lessons that's further down on the sequence of instruction on that original diagram we showed you, and you're getting 4 exemplars or examples of one of the orthographic patterns they're learning, and then it set shifts to another. So I'm interleaving these ideas in this context, and those are different orthographic patterns that are linked to different sound structures. Now that's interleaving because we have it. And now on the bottom, you have a new context. You have a varied context because now I've actually made it more difficult. And I may not actually use this on the first day of learning or even the second or third. I might not bring this, but the set shift has shifted to where there's another orthographic pattern, one after another, which forces the student to engage, put effort and attention into set shifting to be accurate with reading that word. A productive struggle is going to ensue. And this is for accuracy practice. So there's going to be lots of scaffold and support in doing this. This would be daily practice that would be built in, not 20 to 30 bloody minutes talking to the kids with a script. This time of 5 minutes or less to do this activity built over this lesson cycle is giving them practice on these concepts. Now let's keep going, because that's not the only context we want practice to happen on a daily basis. This is the IES practice guide that Barbara Foreman's group, her panel, Michael Coyne and others were on it, came up with. Since the National Reading Panel's research, they reviewed all the federally funded research up to this point, up to around 2015, because this was published in 2016. Recommendation 3 was you're supposed to be teaching word parts directly, and these things that we've been modeling, directly teach those phonograms, and then we're going to have isolated practice with them. But here's the thing. Every bloody day, you're supposed to read connected text based on what the federal funded research said. And what we don't see in school, Megan, is what? When we go out and have people like Jeannie Wanzak, Stephanie Alataba, Shane Piasta go and look at what happens, how many minutes on average are they actually reading text?
Well, it's less than 5 in some cases. For the kindergarten classroom, 1 minute.
And of course, maybe, but there's less than 5 minutes. And you know who reads even less? The kids who need it the most, the kids in special education settings. And it doesn't matter if they're in gen ed or special ed. Shane Piasta's most recent study said they get a little bit more by like a minute in a gen ed setting than a special ed setting. But less than 5 minutes a day are actually spent reading connected text. That's not daily connected text reading. One of the things that they highlight that I want to point out here is that it's best when it's integrated. So once you've learned those concepts and you're applying them, you want to take and have a new context. You want to apply those words that you're learning how to read into a text passage. That's verbatim taken from her report. Mm-hmm. And that was based on the research that had been done. And this was the one that had solid evidence for it, because there was different levels of evidence across the different recommendations. And this was one of the most solid pieces of evidence.
Beautifully said. And I think this is where we're talking about this progression. And like I said, this is going to be our little work in progress. We're doing some amazing work with Freddie right now. But it's really what we're trying to do, and what we're seeing in schools and in policy is this direct binary of like decodables only, K to 2, and then they jump into complex text immediately without support. Pazam! Like it's like this crazy jump, yet they haven't been taught how to attack words and how to deal with a text that isn't tightly controlled. So we talk about this progression where all of these texts are critical to being part of that daily connected text, and they show up at different points in the progression.
And I want to highlight that right there. I want to stop, because in these wars that we've gotten into within the science of reading camp or within the science camp or whatever you think is, it's decodables are bad. Why do we do them? Or it's like stretch reading is the only way to go. So you got Shanahan over here. You got these people over here. No. The research says that there's a purpose for all of these. What's the purpose of what we're trying to get them to learn? What are we trying to practice that we want them to be able to transfer? And what are we going to do for feedback right there? We have decodable text practices, which have an instructional target that we want to get. They have a certain type of support for them. We need to make all text accessible to students. Accessibility and text accessibility is based on text complexity, was based on the complexity of a text on multiple criteria as it relates to other text. It's based on what the student brings to the learning environment, and it's what the learning environment affords the student to either facilitate and overcome those or not, what they need to do. Oral reading fluency practices are really well defined, and we know what that is. If the goal is oral reading fluency gains, they need to practice reading words with prosody and have a model and immediate word corrective feedback. We know that. And it's really important. And we need high accuracy if you want oral reading fluency gains to be made here. Now, if you want to be able to just to get accurate and to build some vocabulary and background knowledge, a stretch read and also modeling, going to your classroom and picking up a text and applying strategies, if that's what you want them to do, you can't get that with decodable text. You can't do that with oral reading fluency practice. It takes a stretch read. When they have to encounter vocabulary words and know, what am I going to do when I bump into a word that I can't decode? Not a lot of them, but some of them, because that's going to happen in real life.
Absolutely. So well said. And I think when we think about text and binaries, or we think about policy and binaries, it's only this or it's always this. It's It's this and, not one or the other. We're going to show you some examples going back to that. If you think back to that little kind of spiderweb progression of lessons, we're going to show you some examples of what that looks like. So high level decodable readers are so hot right now. So we know a lot about what that looks like. They can be done at home. They can be done echo, choral, partner reading. And here's a great example of one of them that we built. This is where large language models, when prompted correctly with the right databases, are chef's kiss. Takes some work, but really some great work. I think the most important part of this text when we think about decodability is, Tim, what you kind of color coded here, because it wasn't so decodable that I didn't understand what was going. Like, it wasn't just focused on that one pattern that I lost sight of everything else.
So this is a targeted decodable that I've created with instructional design based on learning science and learning principles that Megan and I have been working with here. So you'll see that those blue words are actually exemplars from the current lessons week. And then all the black words come from things that are in the past. So they're all decodable. They're either high frequency words like the, which I didn't code. And did I code the other high frequency words in here with Brown in this one? But everything has been taught except for a handful of these words. And those words are the current target words that we're trying to build off of. And actually, the teacher would come in. You notice that all of those examples of how you would apply and read these texts, choral reading, teacher-led reading with small group instruction. If you've got a very power reader kind of dynamic, you could try that, but you wouldn't necessarily want to do paired reading for this necessarily. But you could do it with certain contexts. Megan has certainly done this as a classroom teacher, as we've been exploring, like, what would you do in your classroom? But you'll notice that it's very thoughtful. So the percentage of words that are a stretch or newly being acquired for accuracy are still fairly low. And you have quite a few, actually the green words are the ones that are the high frequency words that have been taught previously in the sequence of instruction for a 95% group. Now, I could have modeled this with Foundations. I could have modeled this with another word reading program. And in fact, we have some stuff from Foundations in here a little bit later, right?
Yeah, we do.
To model some exemplars of some things that we like about how we could be stretching our reading. So that's how this was designed. And the focus is to, yes, have past learning come back and actually practice learning the other concepts from the past for both decodable words and high frequency words. The goal is not for vocabulary building. It's not necessarily for taking things away. There is a meaning to this text that you could take away, but it really is to provide accuracy practice with the new concepts, and then to get more exposure and practice with old concepts for both decodable words and high frequency words. And you'll notice that the percentage of words that are going to be harder and more difficult and challenging is fairly low in this text.
Absolutely. And I think this is training wheel text. And I just read I've been working with some folks in London, and one of the greatest eye-opening pieces I learned is they progress through their phonics scope and sequence a heck of a lot faster than we do, and their outcomes are a lot better on those phonics screening checks. And I do wonder what's causing that. And one of the things that we found when chatting with them is, I just read a blog on a London website. They're saying decodables can end after, maybe about 12 months of instruction. And there's, back and forth. It depends on the student, depends on this, that, and the other. But they're almost trying to, even across the pond, start to develop an off-ramp for these texts, because it gets to a point where it gets cumbersome and it kind of impedes learning. So let's jump into that next text, fluency. And this has been really hot right now in the spaces. We've talked a lot about how important this is across all grades. It does have diminishing effects as the students get older into middle and high school, but especially important in elementary school as a key predictor of comprehension ability. I think the biggest thing here, great new research out there, the Read Like Us protocol. I think that was one of Freddie's colleagues, maybe, Jake Downs.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yes. We just read that paper. But there's a lot of great research on this. Some of my favorite that I've done that I actually have some unpublished research on is the partner reading paragraph shrinking protocol. And if you're not familiar with that, we've seen it everywhere. It's just being more intentional about how we're partnering our kids.
And what I want to say really quick about that slide is that those are all recommendations from the Foreman Practice Guide. The protocol for how you set up the learning environment for oral reading fluency practice is crystal clear from the research. The parameters are well specified in the research, which is long in this area. You need to have a model of what it is to read that passage with expression. What we're practicing now is the production, not of accurate reading, because accuracy should be very, very high. You're practicing the fluent reading with decent pace, with good pace. And so you need that model. And all of these are research validated ways to do it. One of the things that we don't necessarily know the difference of is we say repeated reading, which is I take a single passage and I might do it over the course of 5 days in a week, versus wide reading. When you can control the environment to provide these scaffolded supports, where you have a person who, if they get it wrong, you give them the correct word and they move on, which would happen very infrequently because it disrupts your ability to model what you want, which is the articulatory production of fluent reading. And you need that model to model that for you in that type of a setting. Powered pair reading is a really, really good model. And there's tons of research from the leading reading fluency people go back decades that show that that's a really powerful way to do it. It also, as a teacher, when you can pair them up, will buy you time to go into small group instruction, because you can let them go and you can then come back to them later on, because we know that it's an effective way to do it.
We can let them go read, Tim?
Yeah.
Let them
And
do
it's not
the
an independent reading setting.
Absolutely. And they're getting scaffold and support with a peer that they
Mm-hmm.
trust, that can help move them through that progression so that the teacher can spend their most time and attention providing the most scaffold and support for the students who need it the most.
And that information of a peer gives them calibration of knowing how they're doing and to see and understand their growth. And that's part of the learning process. That's a different aspect of learning sciences, but that calibration of what we're able to do is so important. And peer observation is one of the mechanisms that we know drives that. So this is the fluency passage here.
Yeah, and this is just kind of an example. Like I said, this is probably another area that you're very comfortable with, but it's really, there's so much research out there on how to support oral reading fluency and what that looks like in the classroom. If you just Google that IES practice guide, you're going to learn a ton of great ways. You'll see this was also coded.
It's designed for interleaving all of these things. And I've heat mapped this. So the decodable concepts are coded in that blue color. The darker blue, the older the concept is. The older the concept, if we're doing this stuff with the type of isolated word practice that I modeled, the type of decodable text passages that we're modeling, the oral reading fluency practice that I said you can take your power pairs and they can do it with themselves. And I'm also this fluency of this type of fluency reading, you're building that up. You also then have the high frequency words in there in brown. The darker brown they are, the older they are in the concept. We have set up an algorithm so they're at least 2 to 3 weeks old, meaning that they've had daily practice spaced to build accuracy on these for 2 to 3 bloody weeks. There's a learning paradigm being used. There's an algorithm based on learning science for how we have designed that text. Individual student data is ideal and would be best, right? That's how I really want to calibrate these. But as a designer, as someone who's informed how we develop these curricula, we need to have a default way to come up with what we would build them with a design principle. You see that there's interleaving built into this, and the spacing over time is really, really a critical piece to it. I've also underlined the morphemes in there. Those morphemes are also color-coded based on how old they are in the learning system. I am building a meaningful text based off of all the concepts that have come before. This is in the second grade. And by the second grade, we have ample building blocks to do this. By the end of first grade, we have lots of ample building blocks to do this as well.
Amen. We've taught these correspondences, and Tim, like you said, we're moving them into connected text practice. Even if it almost is taking you to the point of you're unsure if you're comfortable, there are kids who can start to pick up on some of these patterns as well. And they don't need as many repetitions as some of those other babies. So giving them this practice within text is going to be critical. But I think the most important piece that we're going to get to is this stretch reading piece. And this is what we really want you to walk away with, knowing that we know some of the literature that supports this and some that hopefully we're going to start doing ourselves. But something we're finding with this curriculum is it's really this decodable or crazy high-level complex text. And Freddie Hybert's research has shown that there's a big flattening of the curriculum over time. You could check out her website where she shows that first grade text is very akin to about fourth grade text. And what does grade level text even mean over time? It's a whole big thing to talk about. But a lot of kids are being asked to read these texts at such a frustration level, and they simply can't access them. So stretch reading allows that access. And we can do this in a lot of different ways. The key area we want to highlight for you is pre-teaching the challenge words that they have not really been taught the orthographic conventions to decode, as well as making sure that there is a positive learning environment, meaning the teacher is there to scaffold when the student comes across a word that might be challenging. And Tim, we said we threw it at the wall. What percentage do we want these texts to be when we think about readability for these kids?
Well, I mean, we can be in the 80 percentile now, 80% here, I think, because we have that support. One of the things that's really important when you look at the research in this area that's being cited to support that we can do this grade level or above reading, the learning context in every study that I've seen cited is that you have support. You have, and this gets back to what I said defines text accessibility. It's its complexity, which is a multi-criteria piece. It's the learner and what they bring to the situation and what the learning environment affords. A text is not accessible with those all three coming into alignment, and that's very old research. And the research that's being cited by other people right now in that has got to be accurately represented to say that there's a learning environment that supports the access to that text. And so this is a stretch read that we've created here based on knowledge of learning. We just said, what if you're quite, well, there's a real reason for this, and we don't have much time, but large language models have a fetish with honeybees. If you ask it to write text or on a content, they will tell you about honeybees. So it's not surprising that when me, Megan, and Freddie were making text recently, we all got text passages on honeybees. So here's an example. We've coded these with the words that are going to be taught for vocabulary, which would be pre-taught, would be given to the child, almost like you would give them the name of a state, Nebraska, if you're reading a decodable passage that has Nebraska in it. And it also has, again, those blue words there, which are the decodable words. So you'll notice those as well as the high frequency words. You'll notice, and I've underlined the morphemes, you'll notice again that there's only a handful of words that are not accessible to the child on their own, more than likely, if they're coming into this, and this is but there's the stretch is really coming in with the vocabulary and the background knowledge words that we're building for them. So that's where it's coming in, and those will be pre-taught and given to them. We did add in sneakily the next concepts that'll be taught. We actually put in there to do some pre-testing and formative assessment. We want to know if some kids are able to actually read those. So we've actually snuck in about 2 to 3 words that'll be examples of what's about to come. And so if you go down here, of course, we're going to read this, but we're doing this also for background knowledge building and vocabulary. And retrieval practice is so critical. So when we get done with this text, we can go in here, and here are examples of the target vocabulary that we wanted them to have. And then when we come in here, here's retrieval-based practice. We put this on the board. We read this to the kid. A honeybee blank is a community of blah, blah, blah. And they give you the answer. They're retrieving colony, which is what they just read about, which is also a word that you just pre-taught. We'll distribute these across this lesson of learning. And this is one example of a retrieval-based practice where they're filling in the blank. They're generating the answer. And here's another. So now they're going to have to give us the answer when we read this question to them. And they generate and they give you the answer. And so we can do these activities to take reading, which is interleaving old concepts for word reading ability, high frequency words, morphemes we've taught them, decodable concepts we've taught them. We've sprinkled in some vocabulary words, which we want them to get, which are going to be harder. And again, if we think about what Freddie's research has shown us, the disciplinary literacy, the vocabulary words that you're probably learning from academics will be rare words that are less frequent, which will not have the ability to be decoded and phonetically decoded or read out as easily as other words. And that's really critical for us to keep in mind is that in disciplinary text, vocabulary is some of the hardest words. So we're modeling exactly what's going to be an obstacle to them accessing text, and we're going to model how they can get at that information. By using a dictionary, by using some type of a tool that they might have at their disposal, and we're going to help them learn knowledge and meaning of those words.
Absolutely. And Tim, so well said. I think we'll end here with just this final slide. If we want our kids to true mastery, it's when they can retrieve and use the idea after time has passed under changed conditions, meaning not the perfect learning environment and that perfect decodable, but under changed and harder conditions in a way that supports the new task. So hopefully you'll give stretch reading a try. Check out Text Project. They've been doing some really great work on this. And we're open to some questions. And thank you so much for that fun hour. Can't hear you, my friend. I don't know if it's just me.
Here we go. Megan and Tim, thank you so much. So much information, and we have some great questions in the Q&A that people have submitted. So let's take a few minutes to go through those. First one is is it okay to move onto a new skill before a prior skill has been mastered, then use interleaving to continue to practice the skill that has not been fully mastered? I think he covered this, but just thought maybe double tapping on it might be good.
Yes, it's actually better learning science. They'd be better than doing it in massed. Again, that massed practice doesn't create the durable trace. You want to do that for a host of reasons. When you restructure a curriculum to be a proficiency-based curriculum with interleaving and these types of tax passages, you'll get better learning outcomes across, especially decent learners. But even when I've worked with redesigning interventions to do this type of a pacing with dyslexic children, we will see gains with them as well. It's all about the practice and the practice reps. Megan, as your classroom experience and your understanding of the literature, what's your answer to that question?
Couldn't agree more. I think if we spend a time on a skill until perfect mastery every time, we're never going to get to what we need them to do. That's where statistical learning and some of that implicit tuning that comes from practice, they kind of happen in tandem.
This is a related concept around this mastery too. You notice that we did not model getting accuracy before we moved to, with automaticity. We're interleaving the type of practice within those texts. But then also when we were doing the oral reading fluency practice, we modeled what the research has said of the parameters for setting up those passages, because the output that you're actually practicing is that expressive reading. And so the choppiness of having a lot of inaccurate words actually does that. That's an important thing to think about when you do a meta-analysis, or you look at those research findings, is what's the outcome that you're trying to do. So if it's oral reading fluency, then that high accuracy rate for the students in those practices is a must, because the practice is there and that learning environment of a model of the efficient reading, and then the occasional just give them the word and they move right on is really critical to that.
Yeah. So it reminds me of the term cognitive redundancy or repetition. Like, how do we do that in a way that's most effective? And that leads us. There's another question here that came in really about programs. They asked, is there any research on how often typical HQIM curricula and pacing guides follow this concept of progression from acquisition to adaptation that you discussed?
I was just on a call with Ola at Obasa University for like a good hour today talking about curriculum and their massive lack of evidence. Not that I'm aware of. I will say Freddie's doing some of the work with the most recent curricula, and the flattening of the curricula is the most robust research I've seen on some curriculum. Haven't seen much. Tim, I don't know if you're aware of any.
So I'm going to say that would be a document review and looking at the curricula. Megan and I both, as well as many other people, do a lot of this because of our work to make all this stuff practical. I can't tell you how many scopes and sequences I've reviewed and I've fed to a large language model to do this. Now, one of the things about Barbara Foreman's practice guides is she talks about obstacles to doing that important work. And one of them is that what you have is a disjointed ecosystem for your learning environment. So if people know me and my history, you know that I used to be the director of research at Wilson Language Training. One of the things that my real world studies showed me in Massachusetts as well as Pennsylvania was that we were beating the pants off of people with foundations on the skills that were being acquired, like the blending, the segmenting, the decoding, and that. But when we got to the end of second grade with Dibbles and the ORF, it's like those leveled readers and the amassed practice with reading text, they always beat us. And that just was so challenging. And I hate to ever evoke this, but Barbara and I had conversations about this. And then Barbara's I think from experience, a very brilliant person. And she had insights that it would be really important for her to have readers that could be a little bit of a stretch. And so we didn't show them to you, but we had the geode readers, which are linked to the sequence of instruction for foundations, which are not strictly decodable, as examples of building knowledge and background. And that was a direct response to Barbara, not saying the data was lying to her, but honoring the fact that she had built trust in me. She knew that I wouldn't tell her something that wasn't true, and she could see with her own eyes that aspects of what was happening. But what was happening is that if you only have 30 days in isolation of this limited set of skills, you can't build the integration across your full ecosystem to have that. But then, of course, your knowledge building comes in there as well. So, I mean, and then writing is so critical. So we don't have an integrated, comprehensive ELA block that does this well. And I'm not aware of any that's currently in an iteration that would do that well at this
Yeah.
point. So an obstacle is that we are inherently segregating out and isolating what we're doing because we don't have a solution there that's been done. And Barbara was trying to achieve an aspect of that solution when the geodes were developed and designed and implemented, because it provided a practice opportunity. If we don't show people, and Megan can probably bump off this, if we tried to highlight how you could save time by doing paired reading so you could then do some of this other stuff in a center's model, if we don't show you how to make these connections and do this, then it's just a siloed thing. So there has to be follow-up in how we apply this. But if you don't know
Yeah.
how to do the thing effectively in your setting, it doesn't even matter if the curriculum did exist, because you have to keep fidelity to it. Megan,
Yeah.
I mean, does that resonate with you?
Oh my God, that big F word, fidelity. I mean, if we did some of these, I see another Q&A in the chat about bloated curriculum. And, you know, if we did every program to strict fidelity, we would be at school until 9 o'clock at night. So it's absurd. And I think if we want you to walk away with anything, we gave you a lot of opportunities of things you can add in and do, and, you know, maybe find better ways to structure text and practice, but find ways to cut a lot of the redundancies, find ways to cut a lot of that over teaching, over scaffolding, and over support that's not necessary. Find ways to pre-assess what those kids know. And then that might be able to be a good place to add in some of these stretch readings. I think we can push students further than what we've been. And I think what we're really missing right now in classrooms is that actual text reading. I can't tell you how many classrooms I've been going in, and not at the fault of teacher. A lot of it's programmatic. A lot of classrooms where reading is just not simply happening. We've seen it from the literature. We're seeing it with our own eyes. We need to get these kids doing the thing. And if you walk away with anything, we want them to do the thing, read and write.
And that integration doesn't apply just to what we're talking about with reading. If we were to take this out further, I would be writing to better reading and to knowledge building. So you have those examples of that vocabulary building. Now I'm having them write about what they're learning about. I'm having them practice spelling and putting those words down. I'm having them build sentences with that previous stuff that they've been taught. And I'm having them thinking about that. So that integration follows through in those important ways. And we don't have a system that actually does that effectively. And we don't have a structured literacy system that does it at all.
Well, thank you both for your answers. I can't leave the question about curriculum without talking about the Hill, because so often, like you said, Megan, you go into the classrooms and students are doing lots of things, but they might not be reading lots of things or spending time doing that. And so often with these low literacy results and rates, we'll go in and schools have bought these nice shiny curriculums. They've bought these great programs that they think are the silver bullet. People believe they're going to work. They spend hours and hours of their time. They bring it home. Teachers are spending all this time learning the curriculum. And we don't always see the results, because are we having those students read? And so often we'll support those teachers, support those administrators to build those systems that help promote that kind of effective reading block, structured literacy, evidence-based instruction, all of that. All right, we have 1 minute left. I want to just hit a couple of the things that you shared today that I want people to take home, aside from make them do the thing, and that is reading.
And writing.
And writing. Yes, writing to read. I love that too, Tim. You mentioned time, effort, and attention.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We want explicit instruction, but also that concept of storage strength. We want repetition over time, otherwise that forgetful curve or forgetting curve that you mentioned. Massed versus spaced instruction. There's time for both. We want both of those, right?
But mainly spaced practice.
Mainly spaced. We want to introduce things.
You get 5 minutes of massed, and then you're on to spaced. Okay, bro, that's all you get. You get 5 minutes at max.
And experts versus novices. Right. So we want to support the idea that we don't want to keep repeating things or instructing things that students already know. Right. We want to reduce those scaffolds.
That could be done in center work, right? If you need to intensify. One of the things that's challenging right now is a lot of programmatic pieces that are used for word study in particular are built to be fairly intensive. And so it's hard to de-intensify those, whereas then we have other places that don't have the intensification that we need. So calibration of that is really, really key. And that's going to take some instructionally redesign to what we're doing. Like diacritic markers are really, really critical one. If you need to teach a diacritic marking, that's great. But that example of always having to code is only coded when you need it. So to have everybody code it and then drop their spelling grade when they spell words right because of it is nonsensical and demotivating for the student. So in a center's work and in small group work, if I need to pull those strategies out and use those with particular students who need it, that's when I do it. That's a differentiator because it is an instructional intensifier.
Nonsensical and demotivating, which I'm going to bring back to that concept of time, effort, and attention.
I'm pissing off a bunch of people today, Megan. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm in it, Tim. I think getting kids engaged and motivated, we want them there. That's where their learning is going to happen. And the last thing we're out of time, but I wanted to talk about this modeling of fluency. It reminded me of my daughter learning to play violin. Right. And that if she was looking at sheet music and she could play the notes, but it didn't sound like the piece of music necessarily until she could hear how that music was played and how she was supposed to play it.
100%.
And so this idea of we might be able to decode the words, but are we able to read it with prosody, with expression, catch ourselves when a word doesn't quite make sense if we mispronounce it. So being able to hear what it's supposed to sound like.
There's two aspects of music that also applies here is practice is slow and challenging. And we're practicing at a rate that allows us to not make too many mistakes because you have to make sure that you mark up your music. And I'm a musician. I had a music scholarship that helped pay my way through college, multiple instruments. But you're right. When you want to play with expression, you have to have that model to help you model that if you're still emerging and you're not a prodigy like John Baptiste or somebody.
Yeah. So I'm going to read two more comments that came in. Where can I get more information on this? We are going to send out a handout about all these resources and slides, or we're not going to send the slides, but we're going to send the information and a handout with resources and where you can find the information. And I have to read Taylor's comment who says, "Love you both. Thank you very much."
I wonder if that's Tay-Tay.
You can also, we will have this webinar on our website at hillforliteracy.org. So we will send out a recording of the webinar that everybody was here, share it widely. Megan and Tim, it has been delightful to host you, to have you, to listen. And thank you so much for joining us, sharing your wisdom.
Mwah.
All right. And to get to our website, you can hover over that QR code. My name is Benjamin Schurz. You can reach out to me. Also, at my email, I'm happy to chat with you and talk with you. And let's go, right? Let's make it happen. All right. Thanks again.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.